Welcome to 15 And, where we grow through the transformative stories and principles from the Bible. I hope you enjoy this teaching. I hope you share it with others. And I hope you go to 15and.org, click the Donate Now button, and support this mission.
I started my official leadership journey at 21 years old as a senior pastor of a small church in a rural county in Indiana. And part of the responsibility of this leadership was the stuff I'm wired up for. It was relocating and buying land and paying that off and building a new building and reorganizing, reimagining. But there's a part of it I wasn't prepared for. And in the context of being in this rural county, this small town, I didn't have a team. I had an assistant. There was a youth pastor, but it wasn't really like a fully built out team. Years later, when I was in contexts that I was leading a church through change, I had a team where people that did things better than me could fulfill those functions. And one of those functions is just what it means to appreciate this element of the care side of things in regards to, visiting people that are shut in and going and seeing people in the nursing home. And when I started off, it was me and this youth pastor, and so that was my responsibility. And I was honored to fulfill it, but it was hard. It wasn't natural for me. And I can remember very vividly making the rounds. You're trying to go see people every so often and going and seeing people that were shut in and going and seeing people that were in the nursing home. Seeing people that were shut in that didn't have the capacity and function that they were used to. Seeing people in the nursing home be in this place where the smell of urine would hit you in the face. These just horrible experiences that people were having in this stage of life that is so painful and so disempowering. Here's what I can't get out of my mind as we dive into today and this message on Heaven Now, number 7. I can't get out of my mind this reality of God, where are you in the midst of this bad? Now, that was a small example for me to share, a simple one. All of us have been touched by tragedy in some way, whether it's directly or people we know, of things that just don't make sense. Like, why, God, why? And these are huge questions. Honestly, it's not even the focus of today's teaching to dive into that question. The big idea of this series is we're always, as Christians, being insecure and kind of waiting for the culture to come to us. And that's just not how this works. It's our job to live transformation from the ground up, to bring heaven now. And we want a heaven later, as this movie ends well, but heaven now, how we live changed, how we live transformed. And there is a wiring. There are people among us who are wired up to bring presence in the midst of the suffering. Now, the way that we talk about it at Site Shift is we talk about it in terms of identity fear. And so what we're looking at today, number 7, is the fear of a bad outcome. The fear of a bad outcome. And we're looking at these identity fears through what I think are kind of the two high watermarks in the New Testament. One is where Paul walks through a list of what God is like, the fruits of the Spirit. Can you imagine a better list than this? We wouldn't need the law to show us where we're dirty if we live these perfectly. This is the penultimate example of what it means to live out the character of God, love and joy and peace. And we're going to get into today's fruit in a minute, and I'll just hold off. And we're also looking at the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes is this core set of Jesus' teaching that's saying, this is what it looks like to live transformed, to not let the insecurity of our lives and our wiring and how we show up in moments to dominate so much so that we're not living heaven now. We want to learn to make these choices when we're most insecure. And yes, some of us are going to connect with some of these different than others, but we need all 9 fruits of the Spirit. We need all the Beatitudes. And this one speaks to me deeply today because, I'm kind of shocked at what I see happening right now, and there's an internet conversation happening, and I shouldn't be shocked. I get it. We're so crazy on the web, but this idea that introspection is bad. And you literally have this kind of conversation happening. You started to see it develop a little bit around therapy last year, and now it's kind of like in its heyday of, introspection is bad. You just shouldn't do it. If you're wired up to make a difference and to lead and to build things that matter, don't slow down, don't think about things. And I get it, because that's an overreaction to the place we've lived for the last decade or so that's overly therapeutic, that's overly obsessed with pain and a fear of a bad outcome. And so you got people going to the other extreme and going, let's just go, just lead, just build, just go. And the problem with that is we rush past some of our big questions. And if you've never been through a moment in life where you've got a big question, again, this is not the point of today's teaching. There are better texts we could walk through for these big questions. But what we're going to look at today is the kind of person who becomes transformed when the fear of bad outcome is no longer dominating how they show up as a leader, how they show up in their life. And I think this is really relevant, especially for Christians, because it is weird to me that we live in a context of knowing we're loved, that faith gives us this courage. And yet so many times I've seen where faith, air quotes, makes people afraid. It's like they get in interactions. I mean, I've been leading Christians through transformation for 2.5 decades. And when you start talking about things that are new ideas to them, they start to get nervous. Like, are you going to deceive me? Are you going to trick me? Is this going to take me away from God and into hell and whatever your thoughts about all that are? And they almost hold their relationship with God in a state of anxiety. Like, I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to think the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. I'm going to believe the wrong thing. Because if I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or believe the wrong thing, it's going to lead to this bad outcome. And so we see this in the work we do with SightShift. We see these kinds of leaders who, live with this fear of what could go wrong. It's a little different than the last fear we looked at. So the last fear, the fear of bad person, they're trying to make the right decisions versus make decisions right. This identity fear is showing up, and they're really trying to control the variables. They're trying to make sure this is going to go just like they want it to. That's why we call the validation identity for this the control freak. They're going to have two extremes. In the proving energy of this, they're trying to control every variable. They're going to bring this intense anxiety and micromanage this thing. So you got a stressful situation with your teenager. You got a stressful situation with a team member. Whatever you're looking at. And even if you don't show up with that energy externally all the time, because in some way you've put a governor on it, although in your most intense situations you don't, internally you're still very wired up. Your mind is energized, not by the mind of Christ, but by what could go wrong. Or we see it in a hiding energy. And the hiding energy is just trying to keep all the options open, really afraid to make a faithful, loyal commitment, because what if I'm wrong? And what if it leads to this bad outcome? So this identity fear, out of all the other ones, has the greater struggle with anxiety. And I'm not weighing in therapeutically on that or making any kind of diagnosis. That's not our lane. At SightShift or 15 and we're for leaders, helping leaders grow, build, and develop. But the way this shows up in your insecurities is it's the diagnosis that has you completely consumed, and you can't stop refreshing your chart with whatever your medical provider is, right? You're driving to the ER and sitting in the parking lot for hours, wondering if you should go in. It's the kid that you're struggling with, the one that's hardest for you to raise, that you can't stop hovering over. It's endlessly checking your retirement account. It's the relationship that you can't fully commit to just in case. It's something you keep at arm's length, because what if it goes wrong? And what is happening, the energizing impulse of your mind is to try to protect you from something that's going to go wrong. Now, we see a character that I'm captured by because he exemplifies the shift of this so powerfully. And Jesus gives this character a teaching that I think is revolutionary for this identity fear. So in John 3, you have one of the leaders in what's called the Pharisee group, Nicodemus, come to Jesus. Now, it says in John 13, and you can turn there now, and we're going to go through a few verses about Nicodemus, that he came to Jesus at night. And this is interesting because you got to think through, like, I think it was N.T. Wright said the Gospels are like 4 different speakers, all producing this perfectly full sound to help us understand who Jesus is. So John's Gospel, very different, and he's using light and darkness as like these signal flares throughout his Gospel. So light arrives in chapter 1 and darkness doesn't overcome it. The kingdom is the place where things are seen. And so when John tells you Nicodemus comes at night, John is telling you something about Nicodemus. It's literal and it's metaphorical. Now, Nicodemus being this Pharisee, he's also a member of the ruling council, which was the Sanhedrin. He's a teacher of Israel. Jesus calls him the teacher. He's read the texts. He's formed the opinions. He has the institutional standing, but he also has something to lose. He's not a fisherman. He's not a tax collector. He's a name with something to protect. He's got a seat at the table. So he comes at night. And the metaphor of this is that our transformation so often comes in the dark, in the shadow, in the insecurity, in the fear. I'm always trying to pay attention where dark Chris is showing up. He's also coming at night because it's risk management. He's curious. He's noticed something about Jesus that others either aren't noticing or won't admit, but he can't be seen in that curiosity. And so he's managing this variable of association, because if this thing with Jesus goes sideways, and right now it can go in any direction, he wants the conversation, but he doesn't want to pay the price. He doesn't want the cost. One of the things that I hope isn't overly disturbing to your faith, there were other messianic movements. There were other messiahs who built followings. Now, I'm using lowercase m Messiah there, not the capital M Messiah, which we'll get to the development of the story in a minute. So what Nicodemus does now, to your mind, may not make sense. But at that time, in that space, Nicodemus was trying to do the best calculation and analysis that he could. And so what Jesus tells him in John 3, verse 3, and you can just read it with me, he skips the small talk and goes straight to the root. He knows Nicodemus is coming at night. He knows that he's afraid. He knows that he's concerned. And he steps straight into the issue and says this: you must be born again. Now, that was a brilliant communication technique to use with this identity fear. And I'll give you the why on that in a second. I want to focus first on this idea of you must be born again. The Greek word translated again, it carries 2 meanings simultaneously. It can mean born again, and it can mean born from above. John is intentionally using this word to create this double entendre, because Nicodemus only hears you must be born again, even though the word could go either way, which is why his next question, he's like, well, how do I go into my mother's womb again? That's impossible. He's asking about a mechanism he could engineer, he could control. Here's what's powerful about what Jesus does with this identity fear. He speaks to Nicodemus in a metaphor. He's saying you've got to be born again, but he doesn't mean born literally. He doesn't mean you have to be born again and you go into your mother's womb the second time. He's using a metaphor because the fear of bad outcome can have a difficulty when they're feeling anxious, understanding metaphorical communication. They get tunnel vision. They get anxious, and so they get locked in on literal meanings, which is why it's very hard to communicate to someone who's consumed in this fear at that moment. And so what Jesus does that's so brilliant, and it's why God communicates through metaphor throughout Scripture, because metaphor is the doorway into, we could say it this way, the right side of our mind. Or, better stated, where the left and the right mind come together, the prefrontal cortex relaxes. You don't go to someone who's having a fear of bad outcome with a direct prefrontal cortex attack, and you're going to logically and linearly lead them through it. That's not how you interact with this identity fear. You capture them with a metaphor. And by capturing them with a metaphor, you have a greater chance of helping them shift into a transformation. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's saying, you must be born from above. This is a gift that you receive. See, this is the first wound the fear of bad outcome had register in their life in some way. A bad thing happened in their life, and it communicated this message to them. You better stay hypervigilant so that other bad things don't occur in your life. It could be at a young age. It's the first death you experience. You lose maybe a sibling or a mother or a father. A divorce occurs. A grandparent dies. Whatever are these things that help you in a terrible way touch the vulnerability of life, that we can't control all that we think we can control. And so what Jesus is saying to Nicodemus right here, and it's funny to me how people quote this all the time without really understanding the context. He's saying, you don't engineer this, you receive it. It's so wild to me because the people that quote this all the time almost quote it like it's something you engineer. It's something you make happen. So Nicodemus, he's coming to ask about signs and miracles. And you see this in the passage. Read it later. Jesus doesn't go into a place of, hey, let me explain my ministry to you. Let me give you a logical, linear analysis for why I'm doing what I'm doing. He's not saying, let me give you better information. Let me overwhelm you with the data. He's saying this to Nicodemus. You've got to die to who you currently are and come back as someone you don't yet recognize. Now, Nicodemus' response in verse 9 is the response of a man who has, at some level, been touched by a fear of bad outcome at probably a young age and has spent his whole life trying to avoid and remove and counter all uncertainty. And so in verse 9, he says, how can these things be? I don't get the metaphor. I don't get what you're saying. He wants the mechanism. He wants the process map. He wants the steps. He wants to know what happens before he commits. And then Jesus doesn't give him one. And Jesus responds to him. I want to go back to verse 8 because what John is doing and showing us in Jesus' response is absolutely brilliant for the fear of bad outcome. I'll read verse 8 to you this way. He says, the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. Simple observation here. You can't see the wind, but you see what it moves. I mean, for me, it's very renewing to just look outside and see leaves blowing in the wind. I can't see the wind, but I see the result of the wind. Then the next part of that verse, this is really cool when you understand it. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. Now, full stop here. The word for spirit, pneuma, is the same word for wind. So when translators translate the first word wind and the second word spirit, they're not just doing that in a vacuum. Because the context of this whole passage is Jesus is saying to Nicodemus, you've got to be born again. And you're born of the Spirit, not your mother's womb. It's not literal. It is it's a transformation you receive. It is something that literally happens to you, but you're not going back into your mother's womb. You could translate this verse this way. The Spirit blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. You just see the evidence of the blowing of the Spirit. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. You could also translate it this way. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So is everyone who is born of the wind. Whoa. For fear of bad outcome, this is so powerful. Why? Because whether you put the word wind there or spirit, and I believe what translators are doing here is intellectually faithful to the context of the passage. The wind goes where it goes. We just see the results. You can't control it. You see what it moves. The Spirit goes where it goes. You can't control it. You see what it does. You see what it moves. What Jesus is doing with Nicodemus here is so powerful for this fear of bad outcome, because he's saying, Nicodemus, the transformation here is for you to realize it's not about your control. Now, there are plenty of people, and some of the other identity fears need to bring more effort to bear. If you're fear of belonging and you're worried about bringing up issues, that was the third one in the Heaven Now series, you need to bring more effort. You need to bring more intentionality. You need to bring things up in conversation that you're avoiding because you're trying to keep peace and you're not making peace, and nurturing out a diversity that is in the context of the group you care about, family, team, whatever. The energy here is different. The fear of bad outcome, let it go some, okay? Fear of bad outcome. You must be born again, and you must be born of the wind. You must be born of the Spirit, and the Spirit blows where it will. You don't control its direction. You can't manage its variables. You can hear it, and you can move with it, Nicodemus, but you can't manage it. You can't engineer it. This isn't an information transfer. This isn't a decision for Nicodemus to just make and be done. It's the death to the way that you've been living. What got you here, Nicodemus, is trying to control all the variables. Great freaking job getting here. I mean, you are the teacher. You are a part of the Sanhedrin. You're in the Pharisees. But listen, great job getting here, but it ain't going to get you in the kingdom. It's a different way of living. All of these identity fears that we're walking through in this Heaven Now series confront us at the deepest level of our insecurities. And what Nicodemus has to see for himself is this is a beginning to a new way of being where the outcome is not always yours to control, which is why the whole chapter ends with Jesus' words and not his. Jesus is inviting him into a future that he hasn't yet ever experienced. He can't imagine something he hasn't tasted. So he must be born of the wind, born of the Spirit, to start living like someone who moves with the Spirit. This is why you can tell when someone with the fear of bad outcome is avoiding a death and a rebirth that they need, because in some way they are over-indexing on the past. It's a very effective communication technique with the fear of bad outcome to help them get a rooted sense of nostalgia. Look at how God has been faithful to you in the past. Ask them to consider it. I'm asking you to consider it. Look at where God has been faithful to you in the past. That will help you shift out of this control freak energy so that you're not saying, okay, I'll engage, but only if I can manage and control it. No. See, the disciples, we're going to see a contrast with the disciples and exactly what Nicodemus did. The disciples, even though they were closest to Jesus, scattered. Even though the disciples heard the most of Jesus' teaching, they're gone. They're hiding in an upper room behind locked doors. They become small enough to disappear. Jesus cultivates something in Nicodemus that we start to see a transformation and a shift and a turning in him. Now, we'll see it come to bear in the text in a minute, but first I want to show you how the turning is starting to occur. You can look at John 50 with me as we look at Nicodemus' story. John 50 through 51. They're talking about Jesus, the chief priests and Pharisees. They've sent officers to arrest Jesus. The officers come back empty-handed. Nobody's ever spoke like this man. And the council's furious. Verse 50, Nicodemus speaks up. Nicodemus, who had gone to him before Jesus, it says this, and who was one of them, one of the Pharisees, said to them, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? So he's possibly drawing back on Deuteronomy, maybe chapter 1, maybe chapter 17. He's raising a procedural question. So you can see how he's like kind of in, but not all the way in. He's not saying Jesus is innocent. He's not defending the substance of what Jesus teaches. He's just trying to make the move that a fear of bad outcome person makes under pressure. I'm going to buy time. I'm going to slow the worst outcome down without having to take a position. I will hear people with the fear of bad outcome say this phrase, I'm trying to hedge my bets. And there's a time to hedge and there's a time to be careful. But what's happening in the fear of bad outcome is God is often, and we said this whole series is about, God is discipling you through a process. So the smallest moments of your insecurities, you shift into leading for impact, not your own validation. And what God is bringing about as a discipleship process in Nicodemus' life is to draw him through this hedging, this insecurity. I'm going to come at night. I'm going to kind of speak up for Jesus, but I'm not going to go all the way in. Look, if you take something away from this series, and the idea that you take away from this series is you're bad and stupid and wrong and defective as a leader if you want validation. If you want the validation of your insecurities. No. You've been wired up to need validation. The insecurity is trying to get it from humans. What Jesus is inviting Nicodemus into is the process we're all invited into for our insecurities. We have to go to God and get from God when only God can give us. And only God can give Nicodemus a complete assurance of the outcome, that with God, it will all work out in some way, even if a bad circumstance happens. When you're in the tragedy, when you're in the nursing home, when you're in the struggle, when you're in the throes of a bad outcome, the lie the enemy wants you to believe is if you'll control harder, you'll keep these bad outcomes from coming to your life. The Spirit blows where it will. There's a lot of mystery in all this. I don't understand it all. I don't have all the answers for evil, but I know this. I'm invited into a process of surrender and transformation. Now, the other Pharisees see through instantly what's happening with Nicodemus. Verse 52 in John 7, it says this, "Are you also from Galilee?" They're basically making an accusation of association. The thing that Nicodemus was trying to avoid by approaching Jesus at night, now he's being associated with Jesus. And 2 scenes in, Nicodemus has done what the fear of bad outcome leader does. Just enough to keep the conversation alive while protecting his position. He hasn't converted. He's hedged. And this is the place that a lot of leaders live with this insecurity. It's not the worst place. I mean, they've noticed Jesus. They've raised a question. They've not been openly hostile, but they haven't committed either. They're managing their options. What if I go all in on this? What if it goes wrong? And they're not living loyalty. They're afraid to stick their neck out. Now, if you think you're the only person to struggle with this, what we see in the data on the site shift side is lots of leaders have fear of bad outcome. But when fear of bad outcome leads at the helm long enough, they try to parent their kids, not with a vision of who they can become, but trying to keep them from making things, choices, decisions, associations that are going to lead to a bad outcome. And what they do in doing this is they keep the focus on what can go wrong versus seeing what could go right. How good can this get? Now, if I've got a leader at the table who's got fear of bad outcome, if they're being secure in their identity, a gift they offer is where it can go wrong. I'm going to draw that out. But if they're dominated by their insecurity in their most stressed out moments, they're going to over-index on what can go wrong and miss the ways people can be born again and transformed and grow and develop. They're so worried about controlling. They can't allow the child to make mistakes and develop at each stage. They can't allow the leader on their team to make mistakes and grow at each stage. This is why Paul is using a word that is so powerful in the fruit of the Spirit here. And the fruit of the Spirit that we're talking about today for the fear of bad outcome is faithfulness. Faithfulness. Now, the word for faithfulness in Galatians is the exact same word for faith. I think you can interpret it faithfulness. You can translate it that way. Why? Because faith and faithfulness are similar. Let me give you a background. Habakkuk 2:4. Habakkuk in chapter 2, the worst of the worst is happening. It's a bad outcome. God is using a pagan people to grow and develop the insecurity out of his people, the Israelites. And Habakkuk is asking this question. Like, the nursing home has happened. The tragedy has happened. God, where are you in all this? This is bad and this is gross and it sucks. And so Habakkuk 2:4, famous verse, the righteous will live by faith. The righteous will live by faith. Now, Paul takes that up and builds it up throughout his explanation of the gospel in multiple places in the New Testament. And I am telling you that if you have heard that in a Western context, you have probably most likely heard it wrong. The righteous will live by faith, a mental assertion, saying the right phrase, thinking the right thing about God, and then it's going to be okay. If they manage all the variables, the fear of bad outcome holds their relationship with God with anxiety, when that is not at all what this word is about. Paul breaks it down in Romans 1:17. It's his gospel thesis statement. In Galatians 3:11, it's his argument against works righteousness. Hebrews 10:38, whoever wrote Hebrews, it's the bridge into the great faith chapter. It is the hinge text, we could say it this way, of apostolic Christianity. And the way that it's being used is completely backward. You can see the context of this in Habakkuk 3. In Habakkuk 3, it's just a powerful set of verses, so I'm going to read it to you. Verse 17 and 18. Though the fig tree doesn't flourish, nor fruit be in the vines, the labor of the olive fails. The fields yield no food. The flocks are cut off from the fold. In other words, bad on top of bad on top of bad outcome. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. This is the disposition the fear of bad outcome leader has never seen modeled. It's not denial. It's not control. It's not shut down. It's choosing a relationship of commitment. Key phrase, it's choosing a relationship of commitment, even in a context that it doesn't make sense, a bad outcome. Now we see this in Nicodemus' life. And this will explode the gospel for you and help you understand it beyond just the way people throw the word around today. Gospel just meant good news. Gospel just meant good news. That's what the word means. So Jesus has died. This is the worst possible outcome. The disciples have scattered. Peter's denied him 3 times. The crowd that cheers for him now has demanded his crucifixion. The Romans are like, boom, file closed, done. Jesus problem gone. The council of the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, has won. And everybody thinks this Jesus problem is finished. And Nicodemus shows up with Joseph of Arimathea. Now, the other Gospels record this differently. Only John records it, that Nicodemus is involved in the burial of Jesus. So powerful, so profound. John 19, 39 through 40. I'll read it to you. Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night. So John's making this comparison. Look at where Nicodemus was. Afraid, curious, but not willing to show up in the day. That God even works in the night, in the dark, in the insecurity. Nicodemus, who came at first to Jesus by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 Roman pounds. So they took Jesus' body and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. Now I got to slow down real quick on this number. This is 100 Roman pounds. It's like 75 of ours. This is not the burial that you would give an itinerant rabbi. This is the burial of a king. This is a royal burial. I mean, you see that in 2 Chronicles. This is that level. It is wild that Nicodemus is bringing that kind of resource to bear on this death. Nicodemus brings a full king's burial when the bad outcome hasn't been resolved yet. Jesus is dead. I want you to understand here, he's not proving. He's not trying to show others. He's not hiding. He's just declaring a faithfulness, a covenant loyalty, a relationship of commitment. Now, the other Gospels, like I said, they only name Joseph of Arimathea. John is naming Nicodemus to show us this character arc of what he's been through to come to this place. Now, we said in this series, we're coupling these fruits of the Spirit with an identity fear and with a beatitude. The beatitude that fits so perfectly here is Matthew 5:10. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, let me break it down. Makarios, blessed, the place of divine favor. The verb is not the future, it's now, present indicative. Not you will be blessed someday, but fear of bad outcome. You're worried about how it goes. You're blessed right now, even in the persecution. And the kingdom of heaven isn't delivered as a compensation for the future of your suffering. It's heaven now, present possession. The kingdom is located inside the suffering of the person who is faithful, even though the outcome isn't going like they want it to. Nicodemus is voluntarily entering persecution for the sake of righteousness, for the sake of being in right connection. There's no walking it back. He's not looking for procedural cover. There's no nighttime visit this time. He's put his name and his standing and his seat at the table and the equivalent of a small fortune on the body of a man who is dead. Everything he's been working hard to avoid, he's stopped with, trying to avoid. We could say it this way. He's been born again. He's been born of the Spirit, born of the wind. I want to argue it this way, as clear as I know how. John 3 was the invitation. John 19 is where he's showing the full acceptance of it. Jesus communicated to him, not in a linear way, not in an argumentative way, but in a metaphorical invitation. Jesus speaks those words, you've got to be born again. And conversion for Nicodemus is the moment he's willing to bury him in public. This is exactly what the word faith means. Faith is covenant loyalty. Faith isn't certainty about the outcome. It's faithfulness to the relationship when the outcome goes wrong. Nicodemus doesn't yet know about Sunday. He buries Jesus with no resurrection in view. And I think it strips the text of its meaning to say, well, he did this in full confidence, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus would come back to life. No, he doesn't yet know. And there's no upside that he's trying to project. There's no recovery he's anticipating. The outcome is dead, and he stays loyal anyway. Now, I do believe at some level for Nicodemus, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven, the beatitude that connects to this identity fear, in some way he believed, if I am faithful, I am living what I should live, and the rest will take care of itself. That's the move for the fear of bad outcome. It's not going like I thought it would or like I wanted it to. In the end of all things, however all this plays out, it is going to be okay. That is the nature of faith. But the Greek word here for faith that Paul uses, love, joy, peace, as we walk through these fruits of the Spirit, faithfulness, faith and faithfulness are not separated the way modern English separates them. So when Paul writes this word, the righteous will live by pistis, faith, he's not writing about an interior conviction. He's writing about a relationship commitment that is sustained over time, especially when the outcome is bad. They keep coming back to relationship. This is what Habakkuk was talking about, and this is what Nicodemus is living. Not a private religious sentiment. Trust extended on the basis of relationship, not a certainty in outcome. And this is how this wasn't just one of the other messianic movements. This one was different. Christ coming back from the dead. Never have you had a group of people scatter, have an experience that they so lived that they were willing to be martyred for it. And we're here today, 15 and. It's in our name. It's in our name as a grouping and a movement. The reason I call it 15 and is because there were 12 disciples and there were 13 and there were 14 and there were 15. And now it's 15 and you might be disciple 2,322,793. But Nicodemus was there before the story resolved itself. That's the gift these people bring, a faithfulness, a loyalty. It's why the enemy always attacks this identity fear at the level of loyalty. They want full loyalty coming back at them. And if they can't get that validated from another human, rather than getting it from God, which God gives us perfect loyalty, they try to get it from others. And they try to be control freaks to protect bad outcomes, or they're unfaithful and they betray and they cheat. Faith is loyalty across time, especially when the outcome has not arrived or has arrived badly. Now, there are people who could take what I'm saying and falsely, the enemy would apply scripture just like the enemy did to Jesus in the temptations and go, well, you've been unfaithful to God. You've done something you shouldn't, a sin of commission or omission, and you suck, and God isn't going to be faithful to you. No, that's the whole point of the covenant. That is the good news. Even if you're unfaithful, God is faithful. Let the faithfulness from the Trinity, the Father perfectly loving you, the Son giving of himself to you, so you are brother and friend or sister, and you have the Spirit, the intimate companion that blows where it will. This is exactly what we get a wink towards in the story of Job. Job lived this, by the way. Job would be the Old Testament example of someone who went through the transformation. It's not fully realized like we see in Nicodemus or in what the full painting of the gospel really is, but Job has the bad outcome occur. And he has a covenant loyalty, the best he would understand it. This is probably one of the oldest stories in our time that's ever existed, that's written down, told around the fire, way before it was written down. God, all these bad things are happening, not from God. God doesn't test or tempt, James tells us, but even Job falsely believed the bad things came from God. All the bad things happen. All his friends are saying, clearly you've done something wrong. Job stays faithful. I don't know why this has happened. I didn't deserve it. Sometimes bad things just happen. The wind blows where it will, but I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to be loyal. The leaders who bring great transformation through the fear of bad outcome are the kind of leaders who keep showing up no matter what the circumstance brings about. They have an internal resilience, a strength. They can be counted on in the hardest of moments. You will see the mettle of a leader in a crisis. You will see who they really are. And those who have this wiring understand that faith is a gift received. You must be born again. And even though the circumstance is externally threatening, I will keep my eyes moving forward. Let me give you 3 ways I apply this in my own life, because we all have all of these identity fears at some level, and how I help others with it. Number 1, don't get stuck in the deconstruction. I could word it more positively. Number 1, there's reconstruction after the deconstruction. I mean, as a young pastor, when I was sitting in the nursing home and I'm trying to optimize and maximize and lead well and all these words, synergize, collaborate, or whatever, I'm bringing all that leadership energy. I got my Franklin Covey planner. You want to meet? I'll write the meeting down. And I'm sitting in the nursing home and I'm smelling urine and I'm seeing the mistreatment and the hardship of life. And it is in vogue now to look at all the crappy ways people talk about God and represent God in our world today, and all the dumb things we've done out of our own insecurities as Christians to lead in such a way that we think it's our job to be control freaks and to control the culture from top down. Don't get stuck in the deconstruction. There's more after the deconstruction. There are too many deconstruction evangelists today that haven't yet gone to the other side of things where they are born again and they have a new relationship to God and a new sense of mission. Application 2, keep doing the next faithful thing in front of you. That's it. Like, that's the job of this identity fear. It's in the midst of the bad outcome to receive that faithful commitment from God. God says, God will never leave us or forsake us. Out of that faithfulness and that loyalty I receive from God, I give that to others in the midst of maybe their disloyalty to me. Not that I'm foolish with boundaries. I'm healthy. I'm wise. But I'm still going to show up even if you don't. And I'm going to keep doing the next faithful thing in front of me, even if nobody is watching. The fruit of faithfulness is so misunderstood in our world today. I mean, in our context, we're talking a lot to business leaders and ministry leaders. And I think business leaders struggle with keep doing the next faithful thing in front of them because they believe they're going to reach some point where it's like their purpose and their job perfectly align. There are a lot of people out there that have a job that they've never connected to their purpose, and it just feels like a job. So they're not doing their work as unto the Lord, as Scripture says. I can ride in an Uber on any given business trip, and at the lowest level, I get in, they barely acknowledge me. At the medium level, you get in, hey, you get a little greeting. At the top level, hey, Mr. McAllister, there's some bottles of water there. If you need a phone charger, let me know. Is the temperature good? I mean, they're doing it at the highest level. These are people who are bringing their purpose together in the midst of whatever job they find. You might be in a job right now that has 5% purpose or 95% purpose for you. You keep doing the next faithful thing in front of you. Because we're also talking to ministry leaders. In my context, where I pastored for a number of years, a chunk of that pastoring, I was bivocational. And there's this little bit of shame that happens. Like if you're not big enough to do the church thing full time, there's something wrong with you. Let me tell you, there's something very right with you very often, because you understand that maybe in the context you're in, while the job is demanding, you could get it done in a certain frame, and you're having a lot of impact through the week, just like Paul. Making tents. Application number 3, bring the 75 pounds, whatever that looks like for you. This is what Nicodemus did. He went all in before it became real. You're not being asked to be reckless with this. You're being asked to be faithful, and there is a difference. Recklessness is like a loyalty without discernment. Faithfulness is a loyalty that has counted the cost and committed anyway. The fear of bad outcome, it will leave you smaller, it will get you quieter, it will get you less authoritative in your decision-making and your hiding, or it'll go to the other extreme, and you amplify the stress of people around you. You try to hyper-control every variable, and I say to you the same thing Jesus said to Nicodemus. The wind will blow where it blows. And you may have some nightmares happening in your life. And you may be trying to avoid nightmares with all your energy and with all that you can. But it is your job at the end of the day to receive faith, to be born again, the covenant loyalty from God, and to give that out to others. And if you can be that kind of leader, you can be the kind of leader who's counted on in the nursing homes, in the tragedies, in the traumas. Your life isn't defined by the trauma, and so you spend your whole life trying to avoid all bad outcomes. You're empowered and you're transformed through it. And you're willing to publicly commit and go in, just like Nicodemus, to be born again. May we be those kind of leaders.
I hope you enjoyed this teaching from 15 And. Go to 15and.org, share these resources with others, and click the Donate Now button to participate in funding this mission.